Architects lecture. And I'm pleased to introduce tonight's distinguished speaker, Alan Chimacoff. I would like to also thank the firm of Robert A. M. Stern Architects for their yearly sponsorship of this lecture and the broader level of engagement and support they have given the school over the years. Alan Chimacoff has played a seminal role in shaping contemporary attitudes in architectural education and practice. Having been trained as an undergraduate at Cornell School of Architecture, he was fortunate to be a student during the pinnacle years of the school's influence, when many of the great teachers and scholars were present. The group of educators known as the Texas Rangers that included Colin Rowe, Lee Hodgson, Werner Seligman, along with Matthias Ungers and others, were all part of the milieu of faculty that influenced architectural pedagogy for decades. They had formed many future distinguished teachers who had found their way to schools around the world. It should be noted that Rowe and others directly and indirectly contributed to Notre Dame's renewed engagement with tradition and classicism during the 1980s, and then again over the past 25 years. Alan has since been interested in the intersection between modernity and tradition, and how the dialogue between the two has played in the creation of architectural form. His career has spanned ideas and places, and his relationships with notable figures of the architectural world in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has allowed him to explore how we might differentiate and reconcile the old and the new. Alan is a founding principal at Icon 5 Architects. His architecture and planning work is focused primarily on colleges and universities. He has completed major projects at Cornell, Princeton, Columbia, Arizona State, Johns Hopkins, and Syracuse universities, not to mention others, covering a wide range of building types, which include academic and classroom facilities, laboratories, as well as undergraduate and graduate residential and related social buildings. As an educator, he has taught at Cornell and at Princeton universities. He has also been a visiting faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, Syracuse, and the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Most recently, he was drafted by Michael Graves before his death, along with several other practitioners and educators, to create a new curriculum for Keene University's Michael Graves School of Architecture on two campuses, one in Union, New Jersey, and the other in the Wenzhou area of the People's Republic of China. Alan is also a prolific photographer whose abstract and architectural images have been exhibited in Atlanta, Denver, Los Angeles, New York, and Philadelphia. He's currently working in a book entitled New York City, City of Many Cities. I'm looking forward to tonight's lecture, and I hope that Alan's thoughts on the ideological differences and linkages between various strands of architectural thinking will inspire discussion amongst both our students and faculty. Please join me in welcoming Alan Chimacoff to the podium.
I can't follow that. That's better. Which one am I supposed to drink from? Two-fisted drinker. Well, thank you for that. I don't know if I can even remotely live up to it. This talk is really sort of episodic. It has several stages to it. Before getting into that, though, I really would like to thank everybody who's been so generous with time and hosting me. I think it's a fascinating place, especially for someone who's never been here. It's my first visit to Notre Dame, and over the years I've heard a lot, and I've had a lot of opinions of others foisted off on me, and I'm sure you can guess what those opinions were. And so I came. I've met some people, so I know that those opinions are questionable. But I came with a certain amount of healthy skepticism, but an open mind. And I'm bowled over and think that you all are very fortunate to have yourselves, and everything that goes on here. So I've been worrying for most of my adult life about this tension that Michael represented a moment ago, about the tension between the validity of modernity and the validity of traditional ways of doing things. And I feel as if I've had this sort of pendulum swinging at various times, and within me and the work that I've done, and as circumstances of my own work, based on client preferences, context, circumstances of projects, and so forth, demanded actually the responses that I have given, and I'll show some things at the end. The responses in design have almost been schizophrenic. Maybe that's too extreme. But essentially, I've been worried about the kind of polar swings between modernity and traditional things in architecture for quite a long time. And I think somehow that there is a potential for a kind of détente resolution. I've tried to achieve that in the work that I've done and so forth. Basically, this whole talk is about eclecticism, which is the possibility of choice, essentially, based on a diverse range of sources. And sometimes it's used as a bad word, or sort of as a pejorative, where someone says, oh yeah, but he or she just has a bunch of eclectic notions and so forth and so on. It's easy to say something like that, but I think that closer scrutiny, the idea of intellectual probing to choose and select the things that have meaning to you is actually a pretty high calling. So that's to a certain extent what this is about. I'm honored to have this be the Robert Stern Lecture, because he is, in my view, Mr. Eclecticism. And that's, again, not a pejorative thing. I think that I can take issue with some of the buildings, but can't we all, about everyone? But when you look at the quality of the work, the houses that really come from the 19th century ethos, and the bigger buildings that are really steeped in the newer traditions of modernity, things also like, oops, my first push and I hit the wrong button. The imitations of great New York buildings. I mean, they're astutely of their place. And so anyway, it is an honor to be in this kind of context, and I really appreciate it. So this is the first slide of one class that I did. I used to teach a freshman seminar at Princeton. And a freshman seminar at Princeton, everybody comes as just undergraduates. And so the people who end up in a freshman seminar are just interested in the subject. They could end up being physicists or philosophers or architects. And at the time, there were two buildings happening at Princeton, one by Dimitri Porphyrios, who I'm sure you know, and another by Frank Gehry, who I'm sure you know. They were about 1,000 feet apart from one another. They are 1,000 feet apart from one another. And here is Dimitri's building. It's a residential college for about 450 or 500 students. And there is a great long walk that runs through it and runs all the way. This is near the southern end of campus. It runs past a couple of other residential colleges, and it ends up here right at the crux of Frank Gehry's building. And so these happen simultaneously. The world didn't really know what was going to happen, and how could an institution make buildings that look like these two buildings simultaneously? I mean, is this institutional schizophrenia, or is it responsible development? Well, in some senses, it's both. Born a little bit out of fear, a little bit out of necessity, a little bit about what the donors were interested in doing, and this is called Whitman College, which was the principal donation came from Meg Whitman, who ran eBay for many years, Princeton alumna. And this was the gift of Peter Lewis, who was Progressive Insurance Company, and also another Princeton alumnus. And he had done a lot of work and was enchanted by and with Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry designed a house for him. It took around 27 years to design and never got built. So both of these buildings happening simultaneously at Princeton. After the fact, there's actually an interesting video that Peter Lewis sponsored and had paid for and had made that talk about the things. The most interesting parts are quotes from Frank Gehry and Dimitri, where Frank Gehry says, "I don't know, yeah, the kids and their parents like the parents like those Gothic old buildings. They make them comfortable." And on the other end of the spectrum, Dimitri said, "Well, after a certain point, serious architectural exploration ceased, and so it's not really worth thinking about things." So both of those are a little bit extreme. Let me go back one thing, because the first class I taught at Princeton when I got there was a third-year graduate studio, and that's where Dimitri was sitting. And at that time, he was a determined modernist, which was also interesting. And not to say that's it's a problem that people develop their thinking, because we all do, but it's an interesting transition period. So here are essentially the two plans. The traditional, the traditional configured plan that embraces space as compared to the collection of objects that occupy space. That's model photos of each. I got wonderful renderings from Dimitri's office and wonderful CATIA drawings from Frank Gehry's office, where you could, by using the registration marks, you could assemble this building. I probably should have brought those. You could just assemble them to see the various crazy skins go on after the structure was manipulated, etc. So again, the extremes happening simultaneously on the same campus, and nobody really quite knew what to make of them. And people still don't know what to make of them. At the end of, because I'm an architect, and everybody will always ask you, well, what do you think about X and what do you think about Y? And so at the time these were going on, people were saying, well, what do you think about those two buildings going up simultaneously? And the only thing I could say was, well, it's just kind of interesting. You've got to evaluate them differently. You've got to talk about the Gothic building in terms of the other collegiate Gothic buildings on campus and see how they stack up. It's not a great thing or a bad thing to do that. And in terms of the Gehry building, well, you can't deal with it in conventional architectural terms because it's not conventional architecture. You think about it as maybe as sculpture. You can think about it in terms of its use as something of a social arena, because although it's called a library, it's actually one great big communal study hall where men and women students can meet one another, among other things. So moving on, trying to find what the definitions of things are. And there is no prescription for the way we live our lives. The Ten Commandments tell us what we can't do, and what's left over, the space in between, is where we can, what we can do. That's permissible. Follow that with our legal systems or any legal system, and basically it tells you the same thing. You can't do this. You can't hit people with your car. You can't shoot them. But some of them are really quite akin to what legal stuff is quite akin to the Ten Commandments. But how you conduct your life is what we don't tell you about in between. So I think there is a greater degree of prescription in traditional architecture, and certainly if you take a set of prescriptions for classicism, although they're interpretable and variable, and different people have different views about what the better ways of doing them are, mostly they're a series of prescriptive rules that can be interpreted, whereas modern architecture is inherently eclectic. It is inherently the residual space after the thou shalt nots. You can't use ornament, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so it puts a premium on individual invention. And if there's no prescriptions, well, how can it be a style? So here's just an array of early modern architecture, early to middle era, and not going back into the 19th century or anything, but just the initial high points of modern architecture. Small selection. They're very diverse. They all have got none of them obeys the same set of rules. Basically, Le Corbusier's buildings obey his set of rules that it took him a while to figure out, and took him a while to figure out and develop, and Frank Lloyd Wright had his set of rules, and Mies and so forth. Yet they're all called the same thing. A premium on invention. I think it's amazing that in fact the fertility of minds is such a high level that without anybody telling people what to do, they and we collectively can continue to invent new and remarkable things. But personal invention, personal style. So here, I think, this is an interesting statement, and I promise you that I wrote this before I knew that the accrediting board was coming. I promise you, I can show you this was printed at home, and it's on there. So good luck with the accrediting board. They will bring skepticisms, as I'm sure you know, because you've faced them before, and they're. I mean, I don't know what they do these days. I used to know what they did, and for a while they had the screwiest set of criteria where you define yourself to us, and we'll determine whether or not you fulfill your self-definition. And if you defined yourself as a place that made motorcycles as a way to do architecture, and if in fact you were a place that made motorcycles, you'd be accredited. So, but I think what's interesting is that because of the inevitably prevailing skepticism about a school that teaches and focuses on classicism and traditional architecture in today's world, where it's rampant technologies and so forth and so on, I think it's inevitable that the school has to prove itself. That you don't, but you know that you do. I mean, you know that what you're doing is fine, but you do have to prove it repeatedly. And frankly, I think that's kind of healthy. I mean, I was the so-called director of architecture at Princeton when we had a visit, and so I was in charge. We were sort of in between deans, and so I had to write all the preparatory material. And so I got all of this stuff from the previous visit 5 years before and used it as a reference until I realized that it was even out of date 5 years before. And so I asked them if I could have some kind of relief from this huge documentation. They had something at that time that was called a school report or something, which was about 20 pages. So I wrote this 20-page document about what the school stood for and what it did and how it did it, and that became the basis for their visit. But what I realized was that it was to have to do that, anticipating the inevitable onslaught. And if you're not getting an onslaught because you're being curmudgeons and teaching classical architecture, you'll get an onslaught because you're in Princeton, New Jersey, or something like that. That to be able to and to be forced to introspect to the extent of understanding what you believe, it's fabulous. It's a fabulous process. I wish they could send better people. So moving on and getting into the relationship between traditional and modern things. This is a quote at the top that I put it in quotes because that's the way Colin used to quote it, Colin Rowe. It really came from an early Britannica somewhere, and I set my students to find it, and they all found different versions of it. But it's sort of interesting because it's clearly a pre-modern definition. And what I find interesting, I mean, here's the architect, as we all do, just sort of languishing in the and communing with the muses as a dream, but the dream fulfills that, and so much of what classical architecture is about is the anthropomorphism of the columns and so forth. But what is it that makes this Paul Klee modern painting worthy of the title, or even not worthy, but how can you call it architecture? I mean, if it weren't for those two little pediments up there, I don't think you could. But as soon as those are there, sort of, it's the abstract reference to some known form. I think all of a sudden, to me at least, I mean, anybody can interpret this the way they please, but to me, the darkness of this with the golden things, it's sort of a night view with windows and certain illuminations of various sorts. And would I call it architecture? Probably not, but can I understand it that way? Yeah, I can. So at age 26, in 1946, Colin Rowe wrote his first article, The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa. And for anyone who hasn't read it, start reading it now. And if you're lucky, by the time you're Colin's age, when he wrote it, you might understand it in detail. To me, it focuses on, it's amazing because it transformed, I think, architectural critical writing in some respects. But to me, what's interesting and really important about it are three things. One is it identified across several hundred years underlying principles of organization for two buildings that were completely different as being the same. It was a sort of a genius observation and saying that contrary to assumptions that each era is its own flower, if you will, its own set of internal consistencies. Certain aspects are free and can free from time and free from the precepts of style and so forth. The other, and that's I think the part of Colin's article that is most emphasis, but the other is sort of buried a little further back, where he identifies the two characteristics, one of traditional architecture having what he refers to as a parallelized plan and a free section, and modern architecture is having a free plan and a parallelized section. So the independent structural system is what enables the free plan, free facade also, as a matter of fact. And basically it's about a point-supported world where the columns support the slabs. And it permits walls to go wherever they want and facades to be configured however one would want. It doesn't really have any kind of tectonic precepts that go along with it, and so that's been left, I think, to architects to invent. But going to the comparison of the two, and I think the first person who put these plans together this way was probably Tom Schumacher, who was a dear friend who died a few years ago. So Colin's article was about two buildings. One was Le Corbusier's Villa Garges, which was done in 1927, and the other was Palladio's Villa Malcontenta, was, I forget what it is, 1518 or something like that. It'll show up on a subsequent drawing. But the point supports, and these points are exaggerated to make a point. The point-supported buildings permit the walls to be placed wherever anybody wants. Thin exterior walls, because they're not supporting the structure of the building. They're not supporting the floors, as compared to the cellular heavy-duty compression absorbing walls of the Palladio house. So if you look at this and say, okay, it's got a free plan, but it's got these floor planes that are there, and they're insistent, and they have to be there because the columns have to hold them. Can you cut holes in that floor and have space go through? Yes, but inherently, it's still a horizontal planar thing. So the section is paralyzed, and the plan runs free. As I said, it does liberate the facade. We'll look at that in a sec. By contrast, the essential characteristic of the cellular characteristic of this plan is what permits this to be shaped really as sculpted space, if you will, absolutely perfectly natural through the vertical extrusion, determined heights determined by preference and design hierarchically. So the two are in some senses fundamentally divergent from one another. So looking then at the two, try to imagine what it must have been like in the 1920s when you came upon this building for the first time with all glass supporting, apparently visually supporting, some great big mass of, well, it's not really masonry, it's stucco, but it's you know that no matter what a building surface is, it's got to be heavy. It's an astounding condition that runs these ribbon windows through, and the only way that's possible is because the independent structural system enables you to suspend these great big solids from the edges of those slabs. And imagine also trying to figure out, or what would cause one to say this building and this building are sort of cut from the same bolt of conceptual cloth. Well, the exterior is obviously not literally, and so the previous slide that showed the grading of the interior, and it's really about the underlayment of the organization of the plan that I'm talking. But let's compare them. I don't think anybody's ever done this before. Well, first is just an exercise in looking at the Malcontenta, just for its internal consistency, going from the front facade through the superimposing the back facade on it, and you can see that, and you can see it from the plan. To me, this is really an exercise in consistency, where the openings of the plan read all the way through, the secondary zones read all the way through, the pediment of the front of the building, which is columnar supported, column supported, is complete. When you go through a little further to the back side and you realize that that great big double height space that we looked at inside is up through that, it's higher than that, so it cracks the pediment as if it's the space inside that's creating the back facade. There is a really strong and interesting representation of that. So you get a sense that there is an incredible consistency throughout this, throughout the building. And then if you lay Le Corbusier over that, you can begin to see, again, that the observations that Colin made are really quite amazing. That here's the B zone, which is the smaller, it's A, B, A, B, A. The smaller zones run through the entrances and where those little balconies are. You look at the big thing up, big balcony up in the top. It sort of absorbs the dormer height and the top of Palladio, and it works with both front and back. It's kind of amazing. And it was no stretch, by the way, to overlay these two things. I mean, it was really quite trivial. I mean, I kept the proportions of both are intact, and it was actually pretty easy to do. So beyond that, I'd like to take a little excursion to, well, it's not really an excursion. I'd like to look at some work by Michael Graves. I think he felt this place was an important place. I think he loved it. And from what I know, this place appreciates him. And sadly, he left us last year. But I'd like to look about briefly at the span of his work with these ideas in mind, the traditional times and transitional times, rather, beginning around 1969. And as I'm going through this, think about perhaps reading this in time in the opposite way. So if Michael had been of a different era, or if actually even the same era, he could have done these buildings almost in the reverse, or one could have, he couldn't, obviously, he did them the way they did, but in terms of the idea development, they could be read in reverse as the world went from traditional buildings through modern buildings. Michael's were reversed because he started out as an intense modernist. This is the house that he did for Paul Benasroff, who was a Princeton professor. They were about the same age. It was finished in 1969. It's an addition on to one of a whole series of what's the strapped brown and white, black and white style Tudor. So it has no bearing, but is stylistically on the original building, but is standing as a contrasting jewel box. This is not the best view. The best view, I think, is the one that looks at this, which is cut in figural ways and has sort of prefigures as a precursor to his later work as it gets more elaborate and a little bit more ornate. A little bit later than that, in Indianapolis, where Michael grew up, is the Sneiderman House. So, I mean, it's this full-blown ornate cubism, albeit cubism, using elements of traditional architecture for its makeup. And I mean, but the building itself is quite a bit like the paintings. There's a level of consistency woven through, visual consistency. And what I also find interesting is that the color palette, this goes back 45 years or something like that, the color palette was almost completely intact right at the very beginning. So moving then at this point into some rapid transition, a few years later, unfortunately, I don't have any better views of this. This was called the Crooks House, and it is one of a couple of transition pieces from the more abstract modern to the more figural later buildings. And it engages landscape as I think probably the first building that Michael did that engages landscape as part of the fabric of the idea and the thinking. But that exists more in plan and volume, and the building itself was still, and it's not still, was almost uniquely an abstract painting. I don't think it was one other building that he did, which was I didn't have a good picture of, it was a house in Princeton where basically he didn't do the house. It was a small, very tiny addition. It was just a paint job that showed the architecture. But it's a combination here of the abstract landscape or the beginning of the landscape development and the abstract paintings. To me, this is an amazing piece of work. And I'll come back to it. I just wanted to put it in its right place in the sequence. It's an amazing piece of work because it is, I think, transitional in beginning to merge the ideas of traditional forms that demand modern tectonics. As I said, I'll come back to this because I think it's pretty amazing. So along about this time, this image shows up in the world, and I reclaim the quote, and I'm sure this image is better known here than most other places. It was an outrage, absolute outrage. People were pissed off for different reasons. Some people were pissed off because what the hell is anybody doing making full-blown classical architecture at this time of history? Other people were pissed off because, well, how could you bastardize this thing by leaving that thing blank? And what the hell is this freestanding thing doing, pulled off of where it should have been? And if we put it back, you can't put that column back with those columns because it's a different goddamn column. So, and I was one of the people who was pissed off. I was until I started thinking about it. And the more I thought about it, and the more I understood it as something that represented then, and to me still does, an idea that, or a series of ideas that you can represent classicism. You can say, I can make this, I can interpret this in ways that are unexpected, perhaps, border on unethical. I don't know. That's not a fair statement. But depending on who creates this, the ethical statement, it could be. I find it utterly fascinating because to me, it's trapped between wholly traditional and really abstract thinking. And so every time I run across it, and now I can, since I plucked it from the web is great. I plucked it from the web. I can look at it whenever I want. But I know I revere it now. I'm not pissed off at all. I mean, and I take that to be my own mental growth to a greater degree of maturity. Around the same time, the following year, Progressive Architecture magazine asked me to draw what would become the cover of the last issue of the 1970s. So they called this Beyond Modernism. And the idea, I think, is somewhat obvious that there is a classical portal and a modern portal doubling up together through which a number of modern architectural monuments are situated in the landscape of ancient Rome. This was drawn over a photograph of the Aeur model of the city. And so there are embedded in here, well, this is the New York skyline. This is Cahn's Medical Research Building. This is Tarigny. where am I here? There's one of Corbusier's radon blocks turning into the Claudian Aqueduct. This is Mies's brick country house. Le Corbusier's building at Chandigarh. On the Campidoglio is the Villa Garge and ennobled as the rear facade, the front facade, and the plan exposed. Down the road is Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum, a little alto over here by the water, as it is in Cambridge. And for anybody who remembers Stanley Tigerman sinking partway, Mises Crown Hall, so I floated it again. And over here is a combination of Philip Johnson's, what was originally called the AT&T building, is that what it was? With a kind of pantograph X thing, which refers to the Chicago X bracing, rising out of the facade of the, oh, come on. It's in Florence, the Pazzi Chapel. So the modern architecture becomes part of history at that point, and the sort of the game is merged, and so it really represents, I think, the temper of the times, and at that time, with Michael then, which outraged the world probably more than the Thomas Gordon Smith drawing. Because Michael outsmarted the local stars in this. This was a competition for the Portland building, and no one else fulfilled the program requirements and the budget. It came with a budget requirement, so Michael outsmarted them all and made this building that was a huge built piece of classical ornament in a variety of ways. One of the ways that he won, he told me, was they had to submit. They had to submit a construction estimate, not as an estimate, but as a guaranteed price. And they did the competition with a contractor. And the contractor, who was local to Portland, either knew or learned that the perimeter of the site around the outside edges had muck, and it couldn't support more than a couple stories worth of building, whereas there was much better bearing further in. And so they saved a huge quantity of money by just building the building based on a reversal of what the ground would support, and they could build it. But the other guys, Arthur Erickson and I've forgotten who else was involved with the competition, they didn't meet the budget. So then they all claimed foul and tried to have the result reversed, which didn't work. But anyway, so this outraged the world. It still outrages the world a little bit, as people are now saying it doesn't fulfill modern requirements, and it's all the criticism that are leveled against it now, environmentally and so forth, for the way it is used inside. They're all really things that had to happen because of the budget being so small, the small number of windows, the small size of the windows, and so forth. Anyway, there was the Plosek House, which spanned a good number of years, and so I didn't quite know where to put it in here. But it's part of the thought process of the development. I mean, again, I think that this stuff, it's sort of inventive stuff, and that doesn't come from anything literally. And I think in that regard, what Michael was doing here, and then it continued wholesale in the Humana Building, which is traditionally based urban response in this case. Traditionally based forms that really, though, were invented out of Michael's preferences. The rules aren't the rules of traditional architecture or classicism, as much as they are the rules of Michael's as he created another version of a modern style, if you will. So it's again, I think, eclectic, that grows out of Michael's origins in modern thinking. The Denver the Denver complex is really quite extraordinary, and I've got put Morandi in here because really that's what it is. It's sort of a Morandi composition, but it's a contextual condition. They had to preserve, as part of the competition, they had to preserve the original part of the library. And the original part of the library was pretty big, too big to be eaten, and sort of absorbed into a building. And so what happened was that a whole assemblage of parts that created a complex that included the first original piece as one of Morandi's objects was the strategy. And again, the appearance of things is Michael's versions of his own preferences for architecture. So I took this picture of him, must have been around 2010, and I sent it to Michael. This was obviously after Daniel Libeskind's Museum of Contemporary Art was built. I took it as sort of a reference to the Sistine Chapel. I sent it to Michael and never heard anything back. And so I concluded that Mikey didn't like it. I think this is an amazing thing. It's not something that is really well known, but I think that this facade is at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, bears a certain relationship across time and style to the strapped up facade of that Michelangelo had proposed for San Lorenzo, the sort of ABA aspect of things working with the emphasis on the center, in this case, the big roundel located unambiguously in the center to attract attention. Extraordinary work to me. And then going on with that specificity, the body of work, I think, was really amazing. The ability to respond in context to, I mean, this could only be Michael Graves, and it could only be in the Netherlands. I think this is brilliant. This is in Egypt. I mean, we're all over the place. The amount of work. There was an exhibition in the School of Architecture once when he was sort of only partway through all this development of models. And it just filled the whole center portion of the school. It was really an astounding work product. I think it's all connected to the same set of themes, and you can look at this and apply it to I think more generally to the architecture of the times between roughly 1970 and to wherever until the new hyper modernism started. I wanted to return to this because I wish that Michael had had the opportunity or had been forced to build this building, because I think it would have been utterly fascinating to see what changes would have to have been made, to what extent he could have realized it, and how it would have turned out. Because, I mean, certain things are really quite contradictory to the traditional origins of the forms. I mean, the breaking the round arch. First of all, there's two of them because this building is split down the middle and slipped longitudinally. But just looking at the facade, the sort of tinker toy-like column capitals that are virtually the same size and proportion as the keystone, which is a window, and the keystone is, there is no place, there's a place for the keystone, but it's the wrong shape. And it's fallen down and it's held by little ears or something like that. It could only be built using modern technology. And So I would love to have seen what he would have had to do in order to realize it. And I wish, I actually wish he had had to do that, and I wish, because I think it might have slowed him down a little bit, because it's just, to me, it was so utterly interesting to see this, and maybe this is just my own set of preferences, and that's why I call it purposeful ambiguity, because I think the ambiguities are there, and maybe it would not have been possible to do anything that was tectonically credible. I don't know, but I really wish that he'd been forced to do it. So moving on, about the same time, a little bit later, and I'm just making almost random selections. I could be choosing other projects. I'm picking ones that I find particularly interesting. The Sainsbury Wing by Venturi Scott Brown, added on to the National Gallery. It too got everybody pissed off. And it got the modernists pissed off, and it got the classicists pissed off. And I think that probably made Venturi pretty happy. If you look closely at the column, this one floating column is the only sort of the most mature, ripe column, and it's basically the same Corinthian as the centerpiece of the existing museum. The other bundles and things that start to drift are all taken from this sort of odd composite capital order through here. And it goes, though, from an intense detail to drift away and get fainter and fainter as it drifts away. It turns the corner and turns into something that's basically just plainer. And I hark back to this, where there's, to me, a great similarity of thought and purpose to this column and this column, where this one comes basically from back over here. But he was unashamed and unafraid to make something that started literally and just faded. The windows faded and drifted out into a vague frame, again, folding, turning the corner into a plainer, basically modern thing. And again, I think a lot of people don't like it. Probably most people don't like it. I call this reciprocal heresy because for the reasons I stated earlier that fascinate me about this, I mean, in any conventional world, both of these are heretical moves, and that's not bad. So I've been fascinated by this facade. Other people have been fascinated by this facade for quite some time. And I'd like to just talk briefly a little bit about not so much about this facade, more about the fact that while the plan might be the generator, it's the facade that and the exterior of buildings that bear the message and tell the story and deal with whatever context there is. My friend and colleague Tony Vidler wrote a book, not about this, but it was called The Writing of the Walls. And so it's not on the walls, but of the walls. And it's a crucial distinction. If you look through any city, you can learn and just look at the buildings of the city and with somewhat of an educated eye, and just maybe an educated eye, a little bit about the history of styles and at what time in history each one was made. You can learn incredible amounts just by looking at the walls of city buildings. So in another association or appropriation, the blank central panel appropriated by Le Corbusier in 1916 is another kind of leap of time. Did he know that's what he was doing? How could he not? He was so well traveled and so well educated. And clearly, I think what he was saying was that the facade, whether blank or not, controls the street, controls the surface, controls the public realm, and other things can happen in recession behind it. Jumping to Princeton in 1987, Fred Coder and Susie Kim did a residential building, and I know that Fred was enchanted by the Casa Cogolo and Palladio's blank facade, partly because it's blank and so stark, partly because it has such prominence and presence. One of the exercises that I did with in that freshman seminar was a Photoshop cut and paste exercise where they gave them this facade and a set of rules, not a set of rules, just a challenge, which is to make a building that retains the essence of this, that is at least 5 panels wide, maybe more, but doesn't do anything literally like this. Has to maintain the idea of the street or the ground level of the street. And some people just did literal moves, and others decided to become more adventuresome. And they also could either could or had to. They had to make at least 2 panels high. So the level of invention that came out of that was really quite extraordinary. Jumping to a slightly different location, but asking the same question about what makes a facade. Well, we know what that is, which is the center of the Farnese. When you get there, it's completely symmetrical, and it sits symmetrically in space and so forth. But somehow, to me, this image has conjured up similarities, even though there's nothing figural, nothing facade-like about that part of the Guggenheim in Bilbao, except perhaps the sort of centralized stack up of this piece, and that piece. Is it a facade? Question mark. I don't know. Sometimes I think it is. Sometimes I think it isn't. When you get closer to this, then it splays out in quite a different fashion from Farnese, which is symmetrical. This is clearly completely asymmetrical, and so maybe it's not exactly an accident, because this is one localized place that bundle came to be. Does he have that much wisdom and prescience? I don't know, but I find it fascinating to speculate. A quick shot of a few other facades, and the point of this is, again, that modern architecture itself was eclectic in a variety of ways, not to dwell on this. One time as an undergraduate, when I read all the stuff that we know about the plan is the generator. Frank Lloyd writes, were all the great buildings of the world destroyed and only their ground plan remain, the buildings would re-erect themselves and so forth. I thought, God, this is really good stuff. And so I breathlessly pointed it all out to Colin Rowe, who said, well, yeah, dear boy, but it doesn't allow for illusory depth in the vertical surface. How stupid can you be? So I have lived in interesting times. I'll take a quick excursion into my own explorations, several projects in search of détente, feeling the tensions that I've been talking about. I guess I conclude that I'm a committed eclectic, a committed contextualist. Everything I make, I try to make really inextricably of its place. And I hope also that it's always working in pursuit of, or pursuing authenticity, because that to me is really quite crucial. So I was teaching at Princeton University until 1986, when I took a leave and didn't go back. You're allowed to take a 2-year leave, and then after 2 years, you have to decide whether you want to go back to the faculty or not. And so I joined this great big firm in Princeton called Hillier, which no longer exists. And the first project that we got to do was a competition for the School of Architecture, College of Architecture at Arizona State University. One of the other competitors was my undergraduate classmate, Tom Beavy. And it was a phenomenal opportunity to get qualified for it, and we won, and so we built a building. The use of this, where that is a framed picture, and it's really a cipher for everything in the building, which collects the elements together. And this was an existing building on the left-hand side. This was right. The building had to be connected. This building was formerly the College of Design, but the street had to be left open for safety and security vehicles and service and so forth. And so this became a great big common place that a great big 2-story space for reviews and events and so forth. It became really the cipher for the entirety of the new project. I was fascinated. Well, one of the faculty members at ASU said that the building was Johnstone and McIntosh having launched at the Arizona Biltmore. That's the Arizona Biltmore. It is a glorious place. It's an a la Frank Lloyd Wright, a building done by an acolyte named MacArthur, who I think was an architect descendant of the MacArthur House in Oak Park. But I'm not sure of that. And it did, in fact, influence this. The center of this building is a sunken, that's the first floor. This is a level below, a courtyard off of which, and enclosed, off of which the major oratoria and so forth are. Spanning from 1989 to 1993, we did the Howard Hughes Medical Institute's headquarters and conference center. The Howard Hughes Medical Institute was then the largest private philanthropy in the US, if not the world. It since was superseded by the Gates Foundation. But in 1993 or 1989, the Gates hadn't gotten so much money yet. We were included as the 13th of 12 firms and persuaded them through idea and charm to hire us. It is a campus. If they could have, they were very conservative. This is in Chevy Chase, Maryland. If they could have located and purchased a Georgian campus to buy, they would have, and they had, at the time, they only had $5.3 billion, so they could have. That's a long and interesting story that I won't go into, but they really wanted a campus. They viewed themselves as an academic institution. They wanted their headquarters to be like an academic campus. This is the headquarters. This is the conference facility. It's connected together by a common dining place that serves both. They asked, as part of the selection process, if it were possible for us to do our best work, if we had to use traditional forms, etc. And so I said, absolutely not. I said, yes, we can. We'll do our best work. So here you can see, I mean, it's nothing but a string of enclosed offices that are broken and fractured and connected to one another through a variety of means and so forth. There is in the center conservatory, which is really like the outdoor quadrangle, although it's enclosed. They had a very important legal division, and so we made them a law library, which had a kind of, that's this, adjacent to the entrance. The courtyards within the complex are connected both inside and through portals, which can be opened and closed. Then it gets less formal as you go out past the dining, which serves this sort of promenade route that runs through the whole thing. Dining and service coming in from behind. It serves both the headquarters, the conference facility. They bring their researchers who are located around the country at colleges and university medical centers. They bring them back for conferencing and also for continued scrutiny to see if they will renew their support. They're incredibly generous with faculty, but faculty have got to, the researchers have got to continue to perform. So there's guest houses and so forth floating out. There's one common entrance. This doesn't show it up over here where the pointer is, and you come in. This is the entrance immediately for drop off to the headquarters. But then there's this sort of country road that runs around the site, getting people to the conference center. They wanted to have the conferences in different places, but they knew that that was totally impractical. And so we gave them a different place by giving them a long road. What's interesting about this is that it really is, in some senses, constructed in pretty traditional terms. It's their heavy-duty masonry, bearing walls and so forth, except that you may notice there is no car to be seen on this, and yet there is a 180-car parking structure that's beneath the headquarters, and this is the driveway that goes into it. So all of these courtyards and all of these buildings are actually built on a new ground, which is a post-tensioned structural slab. It enabled us to say there's one world beneath that, and that's the structural grid that served the parking, and then the other world above it, which can be as irregular as this plan would have it. And that was, I think, the smartest decision that we made, because otherwise we would never have been able to get the number of cars in there, and it would have been a nightmare worrying about columns going all the way through. So headquarters on the right, this is the parade route going through all the common and open facilities, the auditorium of the conference center, the open spaces and common spaces of the residences. And something that I used in teaching to explain to the freshmen that it's the yolk of the egg that is one of the great organizers visually and spatially of otherwise irregular arrangements of parts. So simultaneous with this, and almost exactly simultaneous, those 4 years, we were doing a laboratory building for materials science at Princeton University. And the building is an abstraction of the idea of materials science, coming from an assumption or assumptions about silicon technologies and fractals and so forth. Essentially that the frame of the building is like silicon, and what happens to that frame, things pushed into it, scratched on it, erupted from it, are all analogous to what happens to silicon to characterize it, to make it usable. Completely abstract building, but very functional and practical. It works as a laboratory building with offices and so forth. Where also this pattern comes from the world of fractal geometries. It also is an homage to, this building was donated by someone named Gordon Wu, who also donated Wu Hall, which was Venturi's building. And so this was really a connection back to the figural panel over the door of Wu Hall elsewhere on campus. The materiality of this changes, and it's sort of significant. The ways in which the idea of references to history by a combination of embedments of things into the walls also is a play on the characterization of the surfaces of the building in relation to the ideas about material science. But seeing things like this, where you never know whether any of those oddities were really intentional. Well, the arch is intentional, but whether this being wood or that being wood, I mean, maybe they just didn't have a piece of stone that big that day. And so there is a kind of seeming arbitrariness of the way things are embedded here, but also since it's material science to a certain extent, at the time was about manufacturing artificial materials that did the same thing as real materials. So one piece and another piece perhaps appearing the same, being similarly colored. One is stone, one is steel, to continue the idea of that. We did a fascinating project at Cornell University. This was the first of 3 that we did. What you see here is a combination of a sadness and a necessity. Sadness because in order to build a modern academic building, this is for the Johnson School of Management, Cornell's business school. In order to do that, we had to eviscerate the building and take out its wood construction because we couldn't make it work legally. And so we did that. As you can see, the exoskeleton that was constructed to hold up the entire exterior of the building as we rebuilt the building from the inside out. Very painful for all the right reasons that things like that should be painful. But nonetheless, we had to figure out what to do about the building and how to make it as authentic as we could. So this is what was there when we got there in 1993. This went between 1993 and 1998. And this was the back side of the building. Originally, the front side of the building was where that tower was on the other side. The campus from 1875 had grown up past this, and the street going past the back was now the most important street on the campus. And so we had to turn it into a front. And it was the historic preservation climate in which this happened was very sensitive and contentious. So we had to figure out ways to make this new building as contextually acceptable and appropriate as we could. There had been, for a period of about 30 years, from 1890-ish to 1925, there had been a conservatory on this portion of the building, which the building was originally made as the women's college, and it confirmed coeducation at Cornell as the second coeducational institution in the country. And so a fitting subject for the young girls to study was botany. So they built a greenhouse, and they had lecture halls and so forth. So once we discovered that, and we knew we had to build out to this side, what we tried to do was to create a sort of a jump shift, starting with the idea of the conservatory reinterpreted, using similarly colored materials. This brick, screaming orange, will eventually get sort of close to that in color because it was sort of that color before it got cleaned. And so it had been 120 years worth of stuff. We actually had, it was purple. This looks kind of purple, but it's more orange than it was. We had to go back and find the right granite, a different granite. So essentially, we built this building on the footprint of the existing building, of the original building. This is almost exactly the footprint, except where the new portion was added. The courtyard space was exactly the same size as what was in that previous open backside. The reconstruction of these walls have exactly the windows, although not the portal through, but ghosted into just simple frames. Or we reused the lintels and the sills. And when it came time to figure out how to enclose this, we did some historic studies and learned that the building originally was made in the model of this building, which was, although not this portion of the building because it didn't exist then, which was the University Museum at Oxford. And so we appropriated some of the geometry of the courtyard fill in the Oxford building and reinterpreted it as sort of a steel lamella structure with some cables to minimize the thickness of things, and created this as the heart of the building. And it's always just filled with people and activities and blood drives and social events. And once wireless showed up, it became a Wi-Fi center, and all of the tables are filled with people doing group study things, and it keeps changing its use moment for moment. So in order to make it as contextual as possible, but not run into the problem of an historic preservation add-on that replicates the building, keep the so-called story of the building intact, the spiky spire on the stairway is made not out of slate the way the original spires are, but made out of a diamond pattern metal. The appropriation of some of the black and white polychromy was pulled through in a more abstract pattern. The dormer gables were appropriated as windows in a reading room in the library that's since been transformed to something else because they don't need the library anymore. Everything's online. And it was really a careful exercise in trying to be as contextually compatible as possible without replicating any of the original stuff. At the same time as that, we were working on another business school building, this one at Columbia on Amsterdam Avenue here and 115th Street. This, again, another influence from that and from Columbia's buildings. There's basically three materials. There's Texas pink granite, and there's limestone and red brick. A figural condition within an abstract pattern, again, not dissimilar from the Princeton building. This too had its own set of interesting stories. I can't go into it; it's too long. But essentially, making an academic building, it's really this is a fairly typical floor plan of case study classrooms like this around a very, very small little atrium. And it's sort of packed with people every time the classes are come out. Again, this taken from obvious sources of inspiration and similar, going back, I don't know, however many years, 10 years or so, to Arizona State and to John Soane. One of the things that's interesting about this is that that stairway that you can see there is an exit stair, and it's made with what's called firelight, which is that clear fire-resistant glass, so that you can actually get light all the way through from the outside of the building into the center of the building through that. It was technically sort of an interesting set of moves. Another problem or project at Cornell, contextually very important and critical, was the creation of the North Campus residential plan and residential halls. We did it in conjunction. The planning we did, we were the lead, but we did it in conjunction with Charles Daggett of Daggett Saylor. We did the residence buildings, which are these buildings here, and Charlie did the common building. We worked through that in a planning exercise that happened for the first several months, and then the projects got divided up. So this is a before, and this is an after, pretty much from the same aerial viewpoint. When I was an undergraduate at Cornell, this building, this sort of trifoil building, had just been built, and I could not imagine how anyone would have had half a brain to do such a thing, nor could I ever imagine I would ever have a chance to do something about it. And so by positioning of these buildings, the spaces around this thing are actually pretty good now. So the exterior of this is sort of a melange of transition between this building, which is all stone, this building, which is a combination of brick and stone, this building, which is brick and God knows what, peanut brittle, and this building, which is all brick, or these buildings, which are all brick. And so what we did was to devise a sort of a fade and dissolve, almost a cinematic approach to saying it's going to start at the lower end, it's going to be all stone, and be then combinations of brick and stone as it goes all the way up, combinations of brick and stone partway. And when you get to the very upper end, this same facade facing in the opposite direction to those all brick buildings, it's all brick. And so it was a fascinating exercise to do. And again, some of these elements, which are all lounges at the ends of the dormitory halls, is all resident stuff. All are still somewhat derived from that fascination with the Palladio facade. Out of the blue, this is something called the Laboratory of Ornithology. Cornell has a big ornithology center. They're sort of the bird center of the world. And this whole area was a combination of wetlands and reconstructed wetlands. There's a great big pond here that actually was dredged in 1957. And so the dredged out pond, which would attract the birds, there was a sort of an ecosystem in this area that the originator of the Laboratory of Ornithology discovered was a real place for birds. And so they dredged out this pond, and they had a bunch of shacks and things that they then built another building and another building and another building. And by the time we got here 50 years later, the pond was now the dredged out pond was a protected wetlands. And so even though someone said, well, maybe we could just go get an extension on the dredging permit. So we don't have to worry about that. But it is, I mean, it was environmentally a very, very sensitive set of explorations and proofs that had to be made. And there was sort of acres of wetlands reconstructed and restored that have all grown back. It's really quite amazing. So this is a research facility and an observatory and a social place that uses that pond and tries to make a world that is compatible with the natural world around it. Lastly, in the last 5 or 6 years, we've been with an amazing madman developer client. We've been developing this project, which is this is all but the final phase. This is 3 phases out of 4. The 4th phase, which is another serpentine, is down over here currently under construction. This woodland was a Photoshop woodlands because that part of the site was still rough when that happened. So that's been put back. So this is a student housing complex, but done privately by these developers. And it will, when it's done, have approximately 1,250 students and 700 cars on about 13.5 acres. Some of these buildings with the red roofs were part of an historic district that has been worked around. The perimeter of these things, you can see sort of polite looking buildings. I call them the appeasement buildings, because it was this project was partly designed by a land planner before we got there. They didn't have an architect. They had this melange of people working, and they had these great big buildings around the perimeter. And I had done several projects in Ithaca, as you saw, and knew that it was never going to get approved unless they atomized those things into much smaller, more polite street buildings. So when you're up there, and I don't have a picture of that, I'm sorry to say, it is actually really quite a beautiful street that was created in that location. And then these serpentines, which range between 4 and 7 stories, including parking beneath, and the parking is all tucked into the hills. Another place where there's in those zones there's parking, and there you can see the bigger openings for parking in that location. The idea of the building really falls into 2 categories of representation, and these are on a developer budget, so they're very inexpensive. And one face of the building, everything that faces southwest, which is what this is made out of multicolors of stucco that are taken from, the colors of which are taken from the geology of the area, which is, there's a whole series of rock-cut gorges there, and with this blue-gray top as the sky. And the other side, when you're looking from north to south, is a series of very inexpensive interlocking diamond pattern metal panels, which represent landscape. And then in order to override the fact that the windows were made out of very inexpensive vinyl, we made them big and fat and orange, so that you couldn't see that the details weren't refined. And it's sort of making things idiot-proof. There's a stone amphitheater that sits down in between this thing. And there are bridges that go, actually there will be eventually, there is currently, you can barely see it here, but I'll show you photos. There's a bridge that connects these 2 buildings, and coming out of this building, there'll be another bridge connecting to the last building. So this here is from the uppermost building to the second building. There is a big open pavilion, open meaning glazed in, with a great big fitness center. And so all the common areas are open and glazed, and there's one bridge that comes through here. This is the back side of this building. So that little nib is where the next bridge will connect, going to the last building. And so in these open glazed spaces between the residences, which are all embedded in behind the stucco and so forth, there are study rooms and little TV lounges and that kind of stuff. Very elaborate landscape, but no cars. These are the back sides of some of the appeasement buildings with State Street over on the far right. Another facade. This is, actually there was a lot of opposition when we were doing this. People said, well, we'll never be able to see across to South Hill anymore. And so we were strategic in making some major openings. And this is at the end, oops. This is at the end of a major street coming out down from Cornell, looking across to West Hill, and it's sort of blown open and a facade at the end of it. And they actually can see a lot more than they ever could through of of what they wanted to see. The last project is one that's about to start construction. It's an unusual relationship. It's in a place called Collegetown, which is right next to Cornell, and it's an unusual relationship between the developer and the university, where the developer is building this building, which is about 75,000 square feet. It will be used by the Johnson School, again, the business school, and it's a combination of classrooms and supporting facilities, open loungy spaces, and pre and post function spaces for the first 3 stories and another one down below, and then offices above that. There's some dramatic stairs that run through the open common public spaces. This is the first building that's going to be built to a new zoning ordinance, which allows buildings to be that much higher than previous, which was actually about, this is inaccurate. Somewhere between here is the actual top height of the previous zoning. So it's bigger. It will probably set a new thematic trend going forward. It is a combination of glass curtain wall and angled metal fins, and I'm worried about it. I'm worried about it for the same reasons I've been worried about all the other things I've been talking about. So I appreciate you're giving me the opportunity to yak at you. Happy to answer questions. And it's been a pleasure being here, truly. Stunned silence. Yes.
Well, I was really looking forward to this lecture, very much for your subject, trying to find a way to bring classicism and modernism together again. You advocate for eclecticism, and I think that's been the path we've been on for a long time now. And I think actually it works pretty good with America by largely we become one big suburb. So when we take these object buildings and scatter them across the landscape, make sure there's plenty of space between them, it looks fine. Here's my question. When we try to do that same strategy in the city, isn't a good direction? And I compare that what we're ending up with traditional cities like London or Rome or Paris, because those cities to me, they reflect the social order that people that inhabit the city. So you have important buildings, you've got subservient buildings, but they all have a place. They all symbolically reflect what they're about, what their importance is, what they're supposed to be doing in the city. Whereas when we fill up buildings, new cities with these very eclectic derived objects that don't really mimic any kind of social order anymore, and that's an end game that I think we're actually approaching as we continue to replace existing buildings in some of our American cities with these object buildings. What do you think of this? Is this a good end game for us to be approaching?
Well, I think that's an important subject, actually. And in his introduction, Michael said that I was part of Michael Graves's advisory group for the creation of the new School of Architecture that turned into the Michael Graves School of Architecture. Well, that's where we met, because Michael was also a part of that. And in the process of discussing a new curriculum for a new architecture school, other people involved in that meeting those meetings were Michael Dennis and Francisco Sanin, and who else? Pardon me? Frank Martinez. And so, and we all agreed with no dissent, we all agreed that the basis of any architecture program ought to be a responsible and a responsive urbanism as a starting point. And I guess my answer to your question is I believe that quality of architecture trumps almost everything. And if you, in terms of what you can put next to what, do I think things have to be consistent in their materialities? Not necessarily, maybe. I mean, it's a choice. Do I think that buildings juxtaposed in cities need to be one way or another respectful of their contextual neighbors? Yes, absolutely. And I don't see that there is a divergence or any kind of disconnect between that. I think that if the idea is that it's important to make streets, to oversimplify, then I think that if you make a great building and it's different from Michael's building and it's different from my building, as long as we're making great buildings, I think they can exist side by side. If you look down some streets where there is an array of old buildings, pre-modern buildings, if the buildings are all good, they seem to sit perfectly fine with one another. And I think that people with a refined eye, and I would say that mine in this, what I'm about to say, is not terribly refined. People with a refined eye, i.e. people who grew up while those buildings were being made, can make much finer distinctions than I can about the subtle differences between traditional building A, B, C, and D. And maybe for some of them it's jarring. It's not for me. They all seem to work perfectly fine together. I think there's a bigger disconnect and a bigger sense of jarring disruption when something that is a more stark comparison or contrast shows up. But even then, I think that if something is really good architecture, it always seems to be okay when it's next to something else that's really good architecture. I haven't had much opportunity to build in cities. I mean, we did the Columbia building and maybe, I don't know, any other buildings. Not much. I mean, most of our work has been campus buildings, and there's a lot more leeway on campus by definition because they're all surrounded almost always. But I think that it's crucial, I think, for the next generations of stuff in this country, for there to be a much more responsible definition of urbanism. And I just came back from LA last week, and I was standing next to, or in front of, or between the Disney Concert Hall and the Broad Museum. That's not really urbanism. I mean, they're energetic. I can see, I actually prefer the Getty, but I would prefer it more if it were like the Guggenheim Museum, where it's a break in some otherwise consistent urban wall, which, gets you to the idea of the background surfaces of urban buildings and special places. Problem with most of what happens nowadays, we were talking about it earlier today, problem with most of what happens nowadays is that in practice, and frankly in most architecture schools, the only thing that's being taught is how to flap your wings and make look at me buildings, and I think that's a real problem. Yeah.
You described your approach basically as contextual, and you tried very hard to have as authentic a building as you possibly could. And there was one project that you showed that was in the context of a sort of almost Victorian kind of thing with the bricks and the high roofs and stuff, where you were sort of putting your building into the old plan, and you tried to keep the plan basically the same as what was before.
Right.
And there's some parts about it that I don't quite understand, so I might make mistakes along the way. But honestly, that seems to me at least inconsistent in the way it's applied, in that we're wanting to keep to the plan exactly as it was, But then on the exterior, that the fenestration changes drastically. I agree that, sometimes materials can change, and that's fine. You can go from a slate roof to a copper roof or to a lead roof. And I think things like that are fine, but that at times where things like fenestration and the amount of wall that's penetrated, that those aren't things that really get to change. So that, on one building or on the original building, you have an arched window or you have a trabeated window, and on this one, on the same story, you have a triangle. That seems at least inconsistent with keeping the plan just as it is, which, to say again, I don't actually think that's quite authentic as well. That plan came up with for a specific program to fill specific needs. And unless those needs are exactly the same, and again, I don't quite understand how that came about, so maybe they are, that seems inauthentic to me. You're forcing the program into the building rather than making the building respond to the program.
I think that's really an interesting set of observations and getting tangled and questions. I'd like to sort of parse it and cut it apart a little bit. The exterior questions, I'm not sure what the right sequence of answers is. I guess I'll take issue with one assumption that you've made, because that will make it easier for me to discuss the other parts, and that is that the choice to use the same configuration of plan to replicate the plan, more or less, was potentially inconsistent with the use difference. And it isn't, unless you believe that the function of something really, really, really dictates what the plan arrangement is and what the plan dimensions are. And in this case, they were pretty compatible, because previously it was dormitory rooms switched to offices. And then there was no interest at all on the part of the user client, meaning the school. There was no interest in having open offices. They were faculty offices and administrative offices that had privacy needs and hierarchy needs and so forth. So I want to just take that part out of the equation, because it wasn't an incompatible thing to do. But even if, let me hedge that bet a little bit, because I don't want to let the point just drift. But even if there had been the necessity of having some open offices, I think that the dimensions of the floor plate were such that we could have left parts of it open, maybe moved a corridor from the middle to an edge of the same dimension building block. Set that aside. Early in the project, before we made the decision to replant the building on its original footprint, I had something that was very different. The exterior wall was in place. There were, where the doors were, suggested the possibility of a very strong cross-axial arrangement. And so I did that, and there was a square courtyard in the middle of this thing, and it looked as if the building had been drained of its soul, basically, because it was a very important building for Cornell. We had a session one day where we put the two plans up. They were both in sketch form, and just yacked about among ourselves on the design team about what the meaning of each was. And in a sense, the cross-axial one had purified or rectified what could have been called mistakes or idiosyncrasies. It took the idiosyncrasies of the original thing out. And it just seemed utterly inauthentic. And so we elected then to rebuild as much as we could on that footprint. The exterior question, and I think there's two parts to an answer, and one is if we well, I'm going to put another precursor in, which is that in the world of adding on to historic buildings, and this was not a listed building, it was not on the register, but it was in Ithaca. They've got a landmarks preservation commission that believes they rule the world, and because they've got a vote, and if they vote the majority no, in some respects they do rule the world. So they were really quite cautious about what they were prepared to permit. But one of the current tenets of adding to historic buildings is that the story of the building always be legible, so that I don't replicate this with the addition, I don't replicate that because that will obscure the story of the building. I'm not sure I believe that wholly. I mean, certainly historically, you look at the buildings that people did when they were completing other people's buildings. And in addition, they replicated things all over the place, and it's only the kind of modern parsing of things and splitting of hairs that gets you there. But I mean, we adopted it because it was part of the ethos of what was going on there, and that's what that was the cast of mind of the collective group of the preservation committee, and so we had to find ways to turn the key a little bit. I think you can perfectly well say, and this I think was where things fall into where you might want to view it one way and I might view it another way and someone else might view it a third way. I think you could say, yeah, it's inconsistent to make triangular windows. But it seemed to me when we were doing it as though that would be a reasonable way to continue the visual geometry and rhythm of the dormer peaks without making dormers. And we couldn't make dormers because we didn't have enough space to do that. So it's sort of a long-winded answer, but and I think that you could perfectly legitimately say what you did, and I can perfectly legitimately disagree. I mean, and that's what makes I don't know, horse racing. Not really. There's always only a winner in horse racing. But I don't. I mean, I guess there are. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know how to. This is a tautology. I wouldn't know how to do it a different way. Sure, I could do it a different way, but it just seemed like the right and appropriate thing to do it. It seemed like actually, it seemed like a positive way to keep the rhythm of those peaky dormers going without getting into the condition of making the dormers.
One more question, because we have the reception right after.
Oh, okay.
I just wanted to hear your experiences in dealing with clients and developers and being able to fulfill your vision as an overall philosophy of architecture and trying to have certain types of aesthetics.
Sometimes
is it a matter of turning down clients or convincing clients, or
you can't.
How do you fulfill what you want?
Some days you get the bear. Some days the bear gets you. I think we always try to have the best communications with our clients. Most of our clients are institutional clients. The developer clients have been pretty enlightened I mean, the two guys in Ithaca that we've been working with, they're enlightened and they're eager to make good architecture. So they've made it easy. At least one of them does, and he's sort of pulling the other guy along, and that's going to work. We did two huge projects with a developer out in Arizona, at Arizona State, two residential projects. There are a lot that work this way nowadays, where the institution leases the land to a developer. Developer builds housing, because there's a revenue flow. The institution and the developer share the revenue by some agreement. And those developers run a range from pretty sophisticated to utterly abysmal. And we had the top of the heap. We were working with a company called American Campus Communities from Austin, Texas. And we also had in those projects an unusual participant that made all the difference in the world, and that was the university architect, who was a man named Ron McCoy, who has subsequently become the university architect at Princeton. He was a Princeton alumnus, but most of those developer projects don't have the benefit of that kind of enlightened client participation. And so you're kind of stuck. But I mean, it is the power of persuasion, power of goodwill, and you don't turn work down. Some people do. I mean, I guess sometimes you turn it down if there's just too much of it. Or, I mean, sure. I mean, there are certain people that you just wouldn't start with. You wouldn't turn it down so much as say, we can't, that's not for us. I mean, other people will do that, and you just don't pursue it.
Alan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions in the gallery?